July 25th, 1944, just before 11 in the morning. Above a narrow strip of Norman countryside between St. Lo and Perrier, the sky began to darken in a way that had never been seen before in the history of warfare. Not with clouds, with aircraft. Roughly 1,500 heavy bombers of the United States 8th Air Force, joined by hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers, droned in long parallel lanes toward a precisely measured rectangle of farmland. The target zone was about 6,000 yards long and 2,200 yards wide. Inside that box, an entire German armored division was waiting. They did not know it yet, but they were standing inside coordinates that had been drawn, measured, and printed by men and women working in a quiet building in Maryland and in interpretation rooms in southern England. In the next few hours, around 4,100 tons of bombs would fall into that rectangle. By midday, the ground itself would no longer look like ground. The German general commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, later described what he saw with a single chilling word: Mondlandschaft, a moonscape. In a post-war manuscript prepared for American military historians, he estimated that 70% of his soldiers were dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. His division had effectively ceased to exist. And it had ceased to exist not because the Americans simply had more bombs. It had ceased to exist because the Americans knew, almost to the meter, where every road, every hedgerow, and every gun position was. They had a map. And on the German side of the front, that map was the most terrifying weapon in the Allied arsenal. This is the story of how American mapping became a battlefield weapon. And it is the story of why German officers, looking back at the war, kept circling the same uncomfortable conclusion. They had not simply been outfought, they had been outdrawn. To understand the scale of what the Americans built, you have to start with a single agency, the United States Army Map Service. Its lineage reached back further than the war itself. As early as 1910, the United States Army had set aside warehouse space at Fort McNair, the site of the old Army War College in Washington, for a small reproduction unit and a lithographic school. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, a young captain named Charles H. Ruth reorganized that little operation in anticipation of the demand the war would create. Under his command, that early central map reproduction plant produced approximately 9 million maps for the American expeditionary forces in France. After the armistice, it was renamed the Engineer Reproduction Plant, and through the long, lean interwar years, it remained the experimental nucleus of all American military photolithography. It was a quiet, almost unnoticed piece of the army. But the men who passed through it had been thinking, decade after decade, about how to print accurate maps fast and in volume. When the next war came, that institutional memory was waiting. The Army Map Service, as such, was formally created in May 1942, when the older Engineer Reproduction Plant at Fort McNair in Washington was merged with the cartographic section of the War Department General Staff. The combined organization moved into a campus on MacArthur Boulevard in Brookmont, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., beside the Delacalia Reservoir. The drafting building was painted in camouflage colors so that it would not stand out from the air. By the end of the war, the Army Map Service had become something the world had never seen before. According to figures released by its own institutional descendant, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and confirmed by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the Library of Congress, and Kent State University historians who studied its workforce, the Army Map Service prepared roughly 40,000 different map titles between 1941 and 1945. Those maps covered around 400,000 square miles. The total number of printed sheets exceeded 500 million. The agency itself employed more than 3,500 people, supplemented by partner agencies, contractors, and university programs. The presses ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Numbers like that can blur into abstraction, so consider what they meant on the ground. For the North African landings of 1942, the Army Map Service produced about 1,000 different maps in 10 million copies. For the Normandy invasion in 1944, the figure rose to approximately 3,000 different maps in roughly 70 million copies. Every infantryman, every tank commander, every paratrooper, every naval gunfire spotter, every engineer, every supply officer, every medic could open a folder and find a printed map of where he was standing. On the German side, by 1944, even senior officers were sometimes working from outdated sheets and captured fragments. To understand why this gap mattered, you have to understand the strategic moment. By the middle of 1942, when the Army Map Service was officially constituted, the war was a global emergency for the Allies. The Japanese had swept across the southwest Pacific. German U-boats were sinking American merchant ships within sight of New York. Rommel was driving toward Egypt. The Soviet Union was bleeding at a rate that no nation had ever sustained. American war production was ramping up, but had not yet caught the world by surprise. In that moment, the United States made a series of decisions whose effects would only become visible later. One of them was to treat geographic intelligence not as a small specialist function, but as a national industrial priority. Maps were ordered in advance of operations that had not yet been planned. Coverage was extended into territory the United States had no immediate intention of fighting in. The reasoning was simple. By the time you needed a map of a place, it was too late to start surveying it. You had to have it ready. So the agency began, in effect, to map the world. But the maps did not draw themselves. And here the story takes a turn that most Americans, even most history enthusiasts, have never heard. Because the people who drafted, traced, lettered, and proofed the lion's share of those maps were not soldiers. They were young women. When the war pulled male cartographers into uniform, the army faced a crisis. There were simply not enough trained map makers in the country. So, in 1942, under the Engineering, Science and Management Wartime Training Program of the United States Office of Education, an associate professor of geography at the University of Chicago, named Edith Putnam Parker, designed an intensive 60-hour college course in military map making. 22 colleges and universities adopted it, including Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, and Kent State. In the program's first year, 200 women completed the course. The Army Map Service then put its graduates through a 4-week in-service training and put them to work. By 1943, the agency's internal newsletter, Reference Point, had given them a nickname that stuck: the Military Mapping Maidens, the 3 M's. They worked up to 70 hours a week. Many of them lived in temporary barracks in Arlington, Virginia, before moving into a civil service housing project called McLean Gardens. By the end of the war, women made up the majority of the Army Map Service workforce. They drafted hydrography. They contoured terrain. They lettered place names in dozens of languages. They proofed sheets that would be folded and stuffed into the pockets of paratroopers a few weeks later. One of them, B. Shaheen McPherson, recruited through Kent State in 1943, recalled in a later interview with the agency's Pathfinder magazine that the women themselves found the nickname charming and accurate. Decades later, in 2016, the 3 M's were inducted as a group into the Geospatial Intelligence Hall of Fame, by which point only a handful of them were still alive to attend. There is a small footnote from the European campaign that gives a sense of how creatively American officers responded when official maps could not keep up with the speed of advance. In the spring of 1944, the United States Army reprinted thousands of copies of the 1939 Michelin Red Guide of France. The Red Guide was not a road map. It was a hotel and restaurant directory, but each entry was paired with a small, precise plan of the town in question, including its streets, public buildings, and railway stations. Those town plans were extraordinarily useful to officers advancing through unfamiliar French communities. Surviving copies of the American military reprint, with their distinctive red covers, are now collector's items. The story illustrates a broader truth about Allied geographic intelligence in the Second World War. The Allies were willing to use any source that worked, from pre-war tourist publications to captured German archives, as long as the information reached the front in time. The Italian campaign produced its own cartographic challenges. The mountains of central and southern Italy, the snow-capped Apennines, the deep river valleys, and the terraced coastal slopes were a nightmare for pre-war mapping, much of it derived from older Italian military surveys that did not match what infantrymen actually encountered on the ground. Engineer combat units of the Fifth Army in Italy worked alongside Allied photo interpreters to produce updated working sheets, often reprinting maps within hours of receiving fresh aerial coverage. At Anzio, in the early months of 1944, American engineers compiled detailed minefield overlays that became models for later operations. At Monte Cassino, the famous Benedictine abbey on its high ground, both sides relied heavily on aerial photography to track each other's movements among the ruins. The Italian campaign, more than any other theatre, demonstrated how vertical the war could become, and how essential it was to render mountain terrain in a way that infantry and artillery could actually use. But personnel was only part of the picture. The other part was technology, and in particular, a piece of American optical and aeronautical engineering that gave the Allies a view of the world no enemy could match. It was called trimetragon photography. A trimetragon installation used 3 synchronized cameras mounted in the belly of a reconnaissance aircraft. One camera pointed straight down, the 2 others pointed 60 degrees outward to the left and right. Together, they captured horizon to horizon, with overlap front and back, on every pass. The lenses were called metragons, manufactured by Bausch & Lomb in Rochester, New York. The cameras were typically Fairchild K-17s with a 6-inch focal length, flown at 20,000 feet. From that altitude, in clear weather, 3 rolls of film became the raw material for an entire region's worth of maps. The system was the brainchild of years of patient work by Captain, later Brigadier General, George W. Goddard, the United States Army Air Force's principal theorist of aerial reconnaissance, who ran experimental development at Wright Field in Ohio. Goddard had been arguing since the 1920s that the future of warfare belonged to whoever could photograph the most ground from the highest altitude with the longest focal length. The maxim associated with his name in the photo reconnaissance trade can be paraphrased simply. In photo reconnaissance, there is no substitute for focal length. The trimetragon system, with its triple cameras and its standardized procedures, was the practical embodiment of that philosophy. The aircraft that delivered most of these images was the F-5. It was a stripped, unarmed photo reconnaissance version of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The pilots flew alone, at high altitude, on oxygen, often for 6 hours at a stretch, on perfectly straight paths above enemy territory and active anti-aircraft fire. They had no guns. They had no escort. They had a camera and a flight plan. A phrase associated with American photo reconnaissance crews captured the spirit of what they did. Alone, unarmed, and unafraid. Back in the United States and at Allied stations across Britain, the negatives those pilots brought home were placed under stereo plotters called multiplex projectors. The multiplex was originally a German invention from the early 1930s, but Bausch & Lomb began manufacturing American versions in the late 1930s under license. With it, 2 overlapping aerial photographs were projected through colored filters and viewed through colored glasses, creating a 3-dimensional model of the terrain that an operator could trace, contour by contour, into a map. The Allies eventually had hundreds of these machines running at once. The Germans had fewer, and after 1943, they had less and less aerial photography to feed them, because Allied air superiority had grounded most of their reconnaissance aircraft. That asymmetry is the foundation of what follows. The Americans could see Europe from above. The Germans, increasingly, could not. There was also a second American innovation that mattered enormously, even if it is less famous: the Mobile Field Reproduction Unit. The United States Army organized specialized engineer topographic battalions that traveled with the front, equipped with portable presses, drafting tables, and stereo plotters. They could take an aerial photograph in the morning, plot terrain from it by midday, and have a printed sheet in a rifleman's hands by evening. Units like the 29th, the 64th, the 648th, the 655th, and the 1633rd Photo Mapping Platoon performed this work across every theatre. The 655th Engineer Topographic Battalion organized at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, on December 17, 1943, deployed to Northwest Europe, and grew over the course of the war to roughly 450 men, producing millions of map sheets for combat units in front of them. There was a third American mapping organization, distinct from the Army Map Service and from the Engineer Topographic Battalions, that also deserves to be mentioned. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that became the ancestor of the Central Intelligence Agency, ran its own map division. It produced a different kind of map. Where the Army Map Service was an industrial press churning out thousands of copies of standardized topographic sheets, the Office of Strategic Services Map Division made hand-drawn analytical maps for senior decision-makers. Maps of where oil refineries stood, maps of which ethnic groups occupied which valleys in the Balkans, maps of where French resistance cells were active. The man who organized that operation was a 26-year-old graduate student named Arthur H. Robinson. In October 1941, he was at Ohio State University, considering whether to leave cartography entirely. By February 1942, he was running a section that would eventually produce close to 5,000 hand-drafted analytical maps, including the great 50-inch globes that were presented to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and to the senior American military leadership. Robinson accompanied United States delegations to the Quebec and Cairo conferences in 1943. He was promoted to major. He received the Legion of Merit in 1946. After the war, he joined the University of Wisconsin and became one of the most influential figures in 20th century cartography. The map projection that bears his name was commissioned by Rand McNally in 1961 and finalized 2 years later. The National Geographic Society adopted it for its world maps in 1988. Most people who have ever looked at a National Geographic world map have looked at Arthur Robinson's work without knowing it. Robinson's was not the only career that the war launched. A geographer named Richard Hartshorne, who had been hired in 1941 to organize the geography division of the agency that became the Office of Strategic Services, was the man who first recruited Robinson. Edward Ackerman, Edward Ullman, Chauncey Harris, Kirk Stone, Robert Voskuil, and dozens of other young American geographers and cartographers cycled through the wartime mapping organizations. After the war, they returned to American universities, where they trained the post-war generation of geographers and cartographers. The discipline of academic geography in the United States was, in many ways, rebuilt around people who had spent the war drawing maps for soldiers. The Pacific Theater had its own specialized mapping enterprise. The 64th Engineer Topographic Battalion operated out of Hawaii. The 648th Engineer Topographic Battalion in the Southwest Pacific became, during the war, one of the major American cartographic units in that theater, equipped with photogrammetric plotters and capable of producing detailed topographic sheets of recently captured islands. The 1633rd Engineer Photo Mapping Platoon added contour lines in September 1944 to a basic island chart that would later guide the assault on a place named Iwo Jima. The Pacific story is not a simple story of American maps always being right and Japanese defenses always being mapped. The reality was more complicated and more honest. At Tarawa, in November 1943, the photo reconnaissance had actually been quite accurate about the visible defenses. The Marine Corps history of the operation records that the troop estimate was within roughly 100 men, and that, in the words of the contemporary report, guns and defensive positions had been accurately plotted by extensive photo reconnaissance from the air and from submarines. What had not been plotted was the tide. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's planners had guessed wrong about the depth of the water over the reef on the morning of the landing, and the landing craft grounded hundreds of yards from the beach. Marines waded ashore through chest-deep water under interlocking machine gun fire. The casualty figures shocked the country. The lessons of Tarawa drove Admiral Turner himself to authorize the formation of the underwater demolition teams in December 1943. Their job became to swim ashore before each Pacific invasion and confirm what the maps could not see beneath the surface. They were the predecessors of today's Navy SEALs. By the time of Iwo Jima in February 1945, the maps were significantly more detailed. The 64th Engineer Topographic Battalion printed a special air and gunnery target map for the Pacific Ocean Areas Command in November 1944 at a scale of 1 to 10,000. The 4th Marine Division produced its own landing chart. And yet, despite all of that, no map had captured the 11-mile network of tunnels that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had hollowed under the volcanic rock. American Marines paid for that gap with over 6,800 dead and 19,000 wounded. Cartographic intelligence, the Pacific demonstrated, could only see what the camera could see. Anything underground had to be discovered the hard way. By 1944, this gap had become a chasm, and it was about to be exploited on a scale that would change the course of the war. The target was the coast of Normandy. The mapping effort for Operation Overlord remains, to this day, one of the largest cartographic projects ever attempted. The Allies pulled together the British Geographical Section General Staff, the Inter-Service Topographical Department at Manchester College in Oxford, the Allied Central Interpretation Unit at Royal Air Force Medmenham, the United States Army Map Service, and Forward Engineer Topographic Battalions. Together, they generated approximately 3,000 distinct map titles. They printed roughly 70 million sheets. The base series was a 1 to 50,000 topographic map originally derived from the French carte d'état-major. On top of that base, the planners layered every kind of overlay imaginable: beach gradients, tidal data, surf conditions, suspected minefields, concrete bunkers, machine gun positions, mortar pits, wire entanglements, flooded fields inland of the dunes. The most secret of these maps were classified above top secret under a special code word: bigot. A bigot map was so closely held that any officer or enlisted man briefed on its contents was said to be bigoted. To carry one off station without authorization could mean court-martial. The maps showed, sector by sector, exactly what would be waiting at Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, but planners did not stop at paper. At a Navy facility called the Special Devices Division at Camp Bradford in Virginia, technicians took stereo aerial photographs of Utah Beach and built a physical, three-dimensional terrain model out of rubber and plaster. The model was constructed in two 4-foot by 4-foot sections. It showed not just the beach, but the inland pastures, the inundated areas behind the dunes, and the network of small roads leading inland. A young naval officer, Lieutenant Charles Lee Burwell, 27 years old at the time, briefed General Dwight Eisenhower, General Bernard Montgomery, and the senior Allied commanders on that model in the days before the invasion. He then carried it aboard transport ships and showed it to landing craft commanders in the final hours before the assault. The Allied Central Interpretation Unit at Royal Air Force Medmenham produced an additional 97 contoured cardboard cutouts of the Normandy coastline, each one covered in rubber and topped with the actual stereo photography. They were small enough to fit on a desk. They were detailed enough to plan a company-sized assault. There was one more category of map that deserves its own mention, because it was hidden in places no one expected and saved lives no one could count: silk maps and rayon maps. The British Escape and Evasion Service, known by its number designation as MI9, had begun the practice in 1939 of printing escape maps onto silk and other fabrics. The fabric maps could be folded into impossibly small squares, hidden inside the lining of a flight jacket, sewn into the heel of a boot, or smuggled into a prison camp inside the cardboard of a board game. They did not rustle, they did not tear when wet, they did not give off the telltale smell of paper. When American officers visited their British counterparts in 1942 and were briefed on the program, they brought the technique home. The Army Map Service began producing its own escape and evasion maps, mostly on rayon acetate rather than true silk. By the end of the war, combined Allied production of fabric escape maps reached into the millions of sheets. They were issued to bomber crews, fighter pilots, paratroopers, commandos, and to the special operations teams that worked behind enemy lines. The famous Zones of France cloth map, dated March 1944, was issued to American paratroopers and to the joint American-British-French Jedburgh teams in the weeks before D-Day. Estimates by historians of the program suggest that hundreds of captured Allied airmen owed their freedom to the small folded squares of fabric concealed in their gear. It was a quiet, unglamorous side of the cartographic war, but it was also a perfect illustration of how thoroughly the Allies had thought through the geography of their fight. They had maps for invasion. They had maps for escape. They had maps for the things they hoped would not happen as well as for the things they planned to do. And yet, and here we have to be honest about what happened next, because no honest documentary can pretend Allied mapping was perfect. There was a single, enormous, costly intelligence failure baked into the Overlord maps, a failure that even the engineers responsible later admitted in plain language: the bocage. The Norman bocage was a centuries-old patchwork of small fields divided by earthen banks several feet high, topped with thick hedges and woven roots, criss-crossed by sunken lanes. From the air, in a vertical aerial photograph, it simply looked like a quilt of green squares. From the ground, with a Sherman tank trying to push through it, every hedgerow was a fortress. The German defenders knew this terrain intimately. The Americans had photographed every meter of it and printed maps showing every hedge, but they had not appreciated what those hedges meant for armored warfare. A post-war engineer history of the campaign quoted the cartographers themselves admitting it. They had collected tens of thousands of aerial photos, built hundreds of terrain models, printed thousands of special maps, and yet they had missed the hedgerows. For 6 brutal weeks after D-Day, that mistake cost American lives. Soldiers died in fields they could see clearly on a map but could not move through. The breakout that everyone had assumed would come in a week instead came in late July. And when it finally came, it came in the form of Operation Cobra. Which brings us back to that morning of July 25th, 1944, and to the moonscape that General Bayerlein described. What made Cobra different was that the lessons of the bocage had been learned. The targeting rectangle was drawn from the most current air photo mapping available. Every German artillery battery, every tank concentration, every command post inside that rectangle had been plotted from images taken in the previous days. The bombers were given a corridor defined by visible ground references. The St. Lo to Perrier's Road was the northern boundary, marked by a long line of bomb release flags. American troops were pulled back roughly 1,200 meters before the strike, a distance that General Omar Bradley believed was the minimum necessary safety margin. It still went wrong in places. Some bombs fell short. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, observing from a forward position, was killed by a friendly bomb. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre of operations. But on the German side of that line, the result was annihilation. Bayerlein later described the bombers coming over as if on a conveyor belt, laying carpet after carpet. Artillery positions wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened. All signal communications cut. No command was possible. Several of his men, he said, went mad and rushed in the open until splinters cut them down. That destruction was not the work of bombs alone. It was the work of bombs guided by maps, American maps, built from American trimetragon photographs, printed by American and British presses, distributed by American and British supply chains, and drafted, in many cases, by women in their 20s working in a camouflaged building outside Washington. The German side of this story is what makes it more than a story of American industrial achievement, because the Germans were not bad map makers. They were, in many ways, brilliant ones. The German Army's Directorate for War Maps and Surveying, the Abteilung für Kriegskarten und Vermessungswesen, had been a model of European cartography between the wars. The Mil-Geo branch produced regional military geographic handbooks at a peak of 102 volumes in 1943. Zeiss optical instruments, particularly the Zeiss stereoplanograph, were considered the finest topographic plotters in the world. According to figures gathered by the German military historians Müller and Hubrick and synthesized in modern academic work, the German services printed more than 500 million maps during the war and shipped 275 million to the front. On paper, that matches American output. But on paper is not the same as in the field, because the German system had a fatal weakness. It depended on pre-war surveys, captured foreign maps, and continuous aerial reconnaissance. By the time of Operation Cobra, 2 of those 3 pillars were gone. Allied air superiority meant German reconnaissance flights were rare and dangerous. Allied advances meant German survey teams could no longer reach the territory they needed to map. The maps the Germans were printing in 1944 were often based on data from 1940 or earlier. The Heeresplannkammer, the Army map repository, had to be moved out of Berlin to escape Allied bombing. Its new home was a small town in Thuringia called Saalfeld. By 1944, the German 7th General Staff Division of the Luftwaffe had also concentrated its mapping records there. In effect, the entire central archive of German military cartography had been packed up and stored in one building in one quiet town. Anyone who could reach Saalfeld could capture the geographic memory of the German war machine. And in April 1945, someone did. His name was Major Floyd W. Hough. He was in his mid-40s, a Cornell-trained civil engineer, a former United States Geological Survey man who had spent his 30s charting forests in the American West and oil concessions in South America. In September 1944, the Office of the Chief of Engineers had given him command of a small specialist unit, The Hough team, 19 people. 3 commissioned officers, 4 engineer consultants, 10 enlisted men, and a German-born interrogator. Their job was to follow Allied combat units into Europe and seize German maps, geodetic data, and survey instruments wherever they could be found. The Hough team arrived in Paris on October 23, 1944. They moved with the front, Aachen in November, Cologne in March, Frankfurt and Wiesbaden later that month. In one Wiesbaden basement, they pulled 18 bundles of survey data from behind a pile of rubble. They carried with them 11,000 index cards, listing American holdings, 1,800 pounds of microfilming equipment, and target lists of German universities, government institutes, and libraries. On April 13, 1945, the United States 87th Infantry Division captured Saalfeld. 4 days later, on April 17, Hough and a small detachment entered the town. They found the mayor. They interrogated a captured officer of the Reich Office for Land Survey, and the officer led them to a warehouse, 30 feet by 50 feet, packed floor to ceiling with crates and rolled sheets, 250 tons of material. The Central German Army Map and Geodetic Data Repository. What Hough's team had walked into was the cartographic memory of an empire. Approximately 100,000 maps covering all of Europe, Asiatic Russia, and parts of North Africa. 7 Zeiss stereoplanographs, the irreplaceable optical instruments that had been the pride of German topography. Survey notebooks, geodetic control data, aerial photograph collections, and printing plates. Hough later estimated that 95% of the geodetic data in that warehouse was previously unknown to the United States military. The team culled the haul to 90 tons, the most valuable material, and packed it into 1,200 boxes. By Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, they had moved 35 truckloads south to the American zone at Bamberg. They kept moving material until July 1, 1945. The next day, July 2, Soviet troops took possession of Saalfeld under the agreed occupation boundaries. The Americans had finished just in time. And there is one more detail in this story that reads like fiction but is documented in National Archives files. After the war, a Hough team officer, Lieutenant Colonel Louis F. Schallenberger, was billeted in a requisitioned Berlin home. He noticed that the cook spoke unusually formal High German. He grew suspicious. The cook's husband, who had been quietly stoking the furnaces of an American Army installation, turned out to be Lieutenant General Gerlach Hemmerich, the man who had led the entire German Army Surveying Directorate from 1936. He was hiding in plain sight, working as a janitor, while his wife pretended to be the family servant. Schallenberger arrested him. The story of why German officers came to regard American mapping as a battlefield weapon is told most clearly not in propaganda or memoirs, but in a quiet, sober, archival project that ran from 1945 to 1954. The United States Army Historical Division established a program called the Foreign Military Studies. Captured senior German officers were given paper, pencils, and time, and asked to write monographs on the campaigns they had fought. More than 2,500 such studies were eventually produced. The catalogue runs to hundreds of pages. The contributors included the most famous names of the Wehrmacht: Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, General Hasso von Manteuffel, General Gunther Blumentritt, General Paul Hauser, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein himself. When you read those studies as a body, a pattern emerges that is hard to miss. German general after German general, writing in confinement, with the war over and reputations on the line, returns again and again to the same theme: Allied air observation, Allied artillery accuracy, Allied operational maps that were always current, always plentiful, and always in the right hands at the right time. Bayerlein's foreign military study on the Panzer Lehr Division, written between August 7 and August 9, 1945, contains the moonscape testimony in its rawest form. His follow-up, the Normandy Critique, written on August 15, 1945, breaks down his casualties in stark terms. Roughly half of his losses, he estimated, came from bombing, 30% from artillery, the rest from other causes. Behind every one of those bombs and shells was a coordinate. Behind every coordinate was a map. Manteuffel's writings on the Battle of the Bulge tell a different but parallel story. He commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. His attack achieved tactical surprise precisely because the dense forest and bad weather had grounded Allied photo reconnaissance for days. The moment the skies cleared on December 23, Allied aircraft were back overhead with cameras, and the German offensive began to collapse. Manteuffel's analysis acknowledged the obvious. Without the cover of weather, the Wehrmacht could not move freely against an enemy that owned the air photograph. Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to Rundstedt, wrote about the Normandy campaign with similar themes. So did Rudolf von Gersdorff in his studies of the 7th Army during Cobra and Mortain. So did Heinrich von Luttwitz, writing about the 2nd Panzer Division in Normandy. None of these officers used the exact phrase battlefield weapon to describe Allied mapping. That phrase is an editorial summary, the cleanest way to express what their testimonies, taken together, amount to. But it is fair as summary, because the evidence is overwhelming and consistent. American and Allied geographic intelligence, expressed as maps and aerial photographs and terrain analyses, was treated by the men on the receiving end as something on the same level as bombs and shells. It killed. It blinded. It dictated where they could move and when. It made the difference between a defensible position and a death trap. If there were any remaining doubt about how the German military itself valued cartographic information, the existence of the Hough team operation answers it. The United States Army did not send 19 specialists across a continent to grab 250 tons of paper because paper was unimportant. It did so because both sides understood, by 1945, that whoever held the maps held the next war. The aftermath of this story is in some ways the most important part of it, because it explains how the wartime apparatus became the foundation of the modern world's geographic infrastructure. The Army Map Service did not stand down after victory over Japan Day. It expanded. In the first 2 weeks of the Korean War, in 1950, the agency distributed 750,000 maps. In the following 2 weeks, it printed 5 million more. In the first 4 weeks alone, the Far East Command in the Pacific received 10 million sheets. Between the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the agency oversaw the application of the Universal Transverse Mercator Grid to over 10,000 maps, covering 400,000 square miles, with 90 million copies printed for use across the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the Vietnam War, between the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the agency printed and shipped maps in volumes measured in the hundreds of millions of sheets. On September 1, 1968, it was redesignated the United States Army Topographic Command. On January 1, 1972, it merged into the Defense Mapping Agency. On October 1, 1996, it was absorbed into the National Imagery and Mapping Agency. In 2003, that body was renamed the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the institution that today supplies satellite imagery, geodetic data, and digital maps to American forces and Allied governments around the world. The Brookmont site itself, where the women of the 3 M's once drafted Normandy beaches by lamplight, was determined eligible for the National Register of Historic Places in 2004 as the Army Map Service Historic District. It now hosts the Intelligence Community Campus Bethesda. The buildings still bear the names of John Charles Fremont and Charles Ruth, 2 of the long line of Army officers who had built the foundation that the wartime generation inherited. The captured German maps from Saalfeld did not gather dust. Many were translated, indexed, and integrated into American Cold War planning. Eventually, large portions of the captured collection were distributed to 35 research libraries across the United States and Canada, including the Library of Congress, the University of California at Berkeley, Stanford University, and McMaster University in Ontario. Anyone curious about how German cartographers saw the Soviet Union in 1941 can still walk into one of those libraries today and unfold the answer. Some of the people in this story lived long enough to see the world they had helped to map become unrecognizable. Arthur H. Robinson, who as a 26-year-old had organized the Office of Strategic Services Cartography section in February 1942 and produced the great 50-inch globes presented to Roosevelt. Churchill and the American military leadership joined the University of Wisconsin after the war. He produced his famous map projection in the early 1960s. The National Geographic Society adopted it for its world maps in 1988. He died in Madison, Wisconsin, on October 10, 2004, at the age of 89. Floyd Hough received the Legion of Merit for his work in Saalfeld. He died in 1976. The team he led was so secret during the war that even now most of the details are known only because researchers like Greg Miller, writing for Smithsonian Magazine, were able to pry them out of National Archives files in the 21st century. B. Shaheen McPherson, the Kent State student who came to Brookmont in 1943, lived into the modern era and gave interviews about her time as a military mapping maiden. So did many of her colleagues. The official induction of the 3 M's into the Geospatial Intelligence Hall of Fame in 2016 was attended by women who, 73 years earlier, had been 20-year-olds inking hedgerows in a camouflaged building. What does this story finally tell us? It tells us that the popular memory of the Second World War is incomplete in an important way. The familiar images, the storming of beaches, the duels of fighter aces, the long convoys at sea, are real. But behind every one of those images, there were men and women in quiet rooms producing the documents that made the action possible. The infantryman on Omaha Beach was carrying, in his pocket or his pack, a folded paper that had been drafted in Maryland and printed in England. The bombardier over Saint-Lô was reading from a target package built from photographs taken by an unarmed pilot at 20,000 feet. The artilleryman behind the lines was firing on a coordinate that had been computed from a survey controlled by data that, in some cases, had been seized from a warehouse in Thuringia just months earlier. It also tells us that the line between civilian and military, between scientist and soldier, between drafting table and battlefield, was thinner than most accounts suggest. A geography professor in Chicago designed the course that trained the women who drew the Normandy assault maps. A graduate student in Ohio became the chief cartographer of the Office of Strategic Services and later changed how the entire world looked at the Earth's surface in print. A Cornell engineer with a passion for South American forests led the team that swept the Central Archive of German military geography out from under the advancing Soviets. And finally, it reminds us that the German officers who wrote those foreign military studies in their cells and barracks rooms after the war had earned the right to be listened to on this point, even if much of what they wrote elsewhere needs to be read with caution. They had been on the receiving end of what American mapping made possible, and they understood it more completely than most American historians did at the time. They were not flattering anyone when they said so. They were describing the thing that had killed their men. Of all the weapons the United States produced during the Second World War, the maps are the ones that have been least remembered and perhaps most quietly decisive. Tanks rusted, bombers were scrapped, battleships were towed to breaker yards. But the geodetic data, the survey instruments, the techniques of aerial photogrammetry, and the trained workforce that made all of it possible, became the seedbed of an entire post-war discipline. Every satellite image streamed to a phone, every navigation app guiding a driver through an unfamiliar city, every drone mission flown by a modern military traces some part of its lineage back to the camouflaged buildings on MacArthur Boulevard, to the women of the 3 M's, to the unarmed pilots flying alone above occupied Europe, and to the small teams who walked into German warehouses with the front lines still smoking behind them. The German generals, in their careful post-war prose, tried to explain to American interrogators why they had lost. They wrote about Hitler's interference. They wrote about fuel shortages. They wrote about partisans in the East and bombing in the West. But running through their words, sometimes openly and sometimes between the lines, was a recognition of something simpler. The enemy had drawn faster, photographed higher, contoured finer, and distributed wider. They had turned a craft once practiced quietly by surveyors and lithographers into an instrument that could shape the modern battlefield itself. That is what they meant. Not that the maps were a metaphor for something larger. That the maps themselves, the paper sheets in folders and the photographs in interpretation rooms and the rubber model on a Plymouth briefing table were a weapon. As real, in the calculus of a battlefield, as a shell or a torpedo, and in the long view of the war, in some places and on some days, more decisive than either.